My son always treated me like a maid. Now he has nothing. They say a mother's love is unconditional, and I suppose that's true. But what they don't tell you is that unconditional doesn't mean unbreakable. I learned that the hard way, sitting in my friend's spare bedroom in Lansboro, Minnesota, watching the snow fall outside a window that wasn't mine, in a house that felt more like home than the one I'd spent 27 years building for my son. My name is Marlene Rowe, and I raised an entitled monster. I know that sounds harsh, but sometimes the truth cuts deep before it heals. For 58 years, I believed that love meant sacrifice, that being a good mother meant putting myself last, always. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about that. It all started innocently enough, the way these things always do. When Colby was born on a bitter February morning in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, the nurses placed this tiny, perfect being in my arms, and I felt my entire world shift. His father, Marcus, stood beside my hospital bed with tears in his eyes, whispering about how we'd give this child everything we never had. We were both teachers then. I taught high school English, he taught history, and we weren't rich by any stretch, but we were rich in love and dreams and foolish optimism. He's going to have opportunities, Marcus said, stroking Colby's impossibly small fingers. He's going to know he's loved every single day of his life. And Lord, did we love that boy. From the moment he took his first breath to the day I packed my last box and left him standing in an empty house, we loved him with everything we had. Maybe that was the problem. We loved him so much we forgot to teach him how to love us back. Kathini. Early years were beautiful. Colby was bright, curious, always asking why about everything. I'd find him at 3 years old, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, completely absorbed in watching ants march across the linoleum. "Mama, where are they going?" he'd ask, and I'd get down on the floor with him, making up stories about ant adventures while dinner burned on the stove. Those were the days when his wonder at the world matched my wonder at him. Marcus and I tag-teamed everything. When Colby had nightmares, we'd take turns rubbing his back until he fell asleep between us in our bed. When he got sick with that terrible flu when he was 5, we spelled each other in shifts, holding him while he threw up, taking his temperature every hour, calling the pediatrician 3 times in one night because we were convinced his fever was too high. We were the kind of parents who kept a detailed baby book, who took pictures of his first steps from 6 different angles, who cried actual tears when he outgrew his favorite dinosaur pajamas. But somewhere in all that love, we started doing things for him instead of teaching him to do things for himself. It began small. I'd make his bed because it was faster than waiting for him to do it right. I'd pack his backpack because I didn't want him to forget his homework. Marcus would tie his shoes because Colby would get frustrated with the laces, and we hated to see him upset. He's still little, I'd tell myself. There's plenty of time for him to learn responsibility. When Colby was 7, Marcus had a heart attack. Just like that. One minute he was grading papers at the kitchen table, making jokes about a student who'd written that World War II ended in 1849, and the next minute he was clutching his chest, looking at me with such confusion and fear that I still see that expression in my dreams sometimes. The paramedics worked on him for 43 minutes. I counted every second. Colby was at his friend Jeremy's house for a sleepover, blissfully, unaware that his entire world was about to change. I sat in that hospital waiting room with my sister Janet, both of us still in our pajamas, and I bargained with God. I promised I'd be a better wife, a better mother, a better person. Anything. Just please don't take Marcus away from us. But God wasn't in a bargaining mood that night. I had to tell Colby the next morning. Jeremy's mother, Carol, brought him home around 9 o'clock, and he came bouncing through the front door with grass stains on his knees and his backpack slung over one shoulder, chattering about the fort they'd built in Jeremy's backyard. When he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes with my eyes red and swollen, he stopped mid-sentence. "Mama? Where's Daddy? How do you tell a 7-year-old that his father isn't coming home?" How do you explain death? To someone who still believes in the tooth fairy? I pulled him onto my lap. He was getting too big for it, really, all long legs and sharp elbows, and I tried to find the words. Daddy got very sick last night, I said, smoothing his cowlick, the way Marcus always did. His heart stopped working, and the doctors couldn't fix it. Colby stared at me for a long moment, processing. Then he said, "But when will he come home?" And I had to break his heart all over again. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, of Colby clinging to my leg while relative strangers told him he was the man of the house now. I wanted to shake them, to tell them he was 7 years old and he just wanted his daddy back. But I was too numb to do anything but nod and thank them for the potato salad or the green beans or whatever dish they'd brought to feed our grief. After, everyone left and the flowers started to wilt. It was just Colby and me in that house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. I had decisions to make, about Marcus's life insurance, about whether to keep working, about how to create a life for us that made sense without the person who'd been the center of our world. I decided to be everything to Colby. Mother, father, provider, protector. I was going to fill every gap Marcus had left behind. I see now how impossible that was, how unhealthy. But grief makes you make promises you can't keep. I went back to work after 2 weeks, which everyone said was too soon. But I needed the routine, and we needed the health insurance. Every morning, I'd wake Colby up at 6:30, make his breakfast, pack his lunch, drive him to school, then drive myself to Eureka Springs High School, where I'd spend the day teaching To Kill a Mockingbird to sophomores who were more interested in their phones than in Scout Finch's lessons about empathy. In the evenings, I'd pick Colby up from after-school care, and we'd go home to our routine. Homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner. Bath time, though he was getting old enough to resist it. Story time, though he was starting to prefer video games to books. Bedtime prayers where we'd always say, "Tell Daddy we love him." Was exhausted all the time, but I told myself this was temporary. Things would get easier as Colby got older, more independent. I just had to hold on until then. But instead of becoming more independent, Colby seemed to need me more. Or maybe I needed him to need me. I'm still not sure which came first. When he forgot his lunch, I'd leave my classroom and drive it to his school. When he had a project due, I'd stay up until midnight helping him build a volcano or a diorama or whatever elaborate thing his teacher had assigned. When he outgrew his clothes, I'd take him shopping and let him pick out whatever he wanted, even if it cost more than I could afford. "You spoil that boy," my sister Janet would say when she visited. "He's going to grow up thinking the world revolves around him." But I'd watch Colby laughing at something on TV, his face lit up with the same smile Marcus used to have, and I'd think, so what if I spoil him a little? He's been through enough. The teenage years were when things really started to shift. Colby hit his growth spurt at 13 and suddenly towered over me, but emotionally he seemed to be moving backward. He stopped doing his own laundry. "You're better at it, Mom." And he'd leave his dishes in the sink for me to clean. When I asked him to take out the trash, he'd roll his eyes and say he'd do it later, but later never came. "Colby, you need to start taking more responsibility around here," I'd say, but my words had no weight behind them. What was I going to do? Ground him? I was tired from teaching all day and grading papers half the night. It was easier to just do things myself. His friends started calling me the Maid behind my back. I heard one of them say it when I was bringing snacks down to the basement where they were playing video games. "Thanks, Mrs. Maid," he'd said, and they'd all laughed. Colby had been right. There. He'd heard it. And he'd said nothing. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Marcus. He would have handled this differently. He would have sat Colby down and explained that families work as a team, that everyone has to contribute. He would have set clear expectations and consequences. But Marcus wasn't there, and I was too tired and too guilty to be the disciplinarian. After all, wasn't it my fault that Colby only had one parent? If I'd taken better care of Marcus, if I'd noticed the warning signs, if I'd made him go to the doctor sooner, the spiral of self-blame was endless and exhausting. So I kept doing everything for Colby, and he kept letting me. When he got his driver's license, I still drove him places because he claimed he was too nervous on the highway. When he started applying to colleges, I filled out most of the applications because he said the essays were too hard. When he graduated high school, I was the one who stayed up all night sewing the buttons back on his cap and gown because he'd forgotten to mention they'd fallen off until 10 o'clock the night before the ceremony. College was supposed to be the fresh start we both needed. Colby got into Arkansas State University with a partial scholarship for digital animation. He'd always been artistic, and his computer skills were impressive when he chose to apply them. I was proud of him, proud that he'd found something he was passionate about. But even away at school, I was still managing his life. He'd call me in a panic because he'd forgotten to register for classes, or because he'd spent his meal plan money on video games and had nothing to eat, or because he needed me to drive up and do his laundry because the dorm machines were too confusing. "Mom, you need to talk to my professor," he'd say. She gave me a C on my project, but I worked really hard on it. And somehow, I'd find myself on the phone with his professor, advocating for my adult son like he was still 7 years old and had forgotten his lunchbox. The other parents in my position, the widowed mothers, the divorced dads raising kids alone, they were gradually stepping back, letting their children make mistakes and learn from them. But I couldn't seem to let go. Every time Colby struggled, even a little bit, I'd swoop in to fix it. I told myself I was being helpful, being loving. I told myself that one day he'd appreciate everything I'd done for him. After college, Colby moved back home. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he got established as a freelance animator, just until he saved enough money for his own place. But months turned into a year, and then 2 years, and suddenly he was 25 years old, and I was still doing his laundry and making his breakfast and cleaning up his messes. By then, his attitude toward me had shifted completely. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was his personal assistant, his housekeeper, his ATM. He'd leave dishes on his bedside table until they grew mold. He'd use the last of the toilet paper and not replace it. He'd eat food I'd bought for myself without asking, then get irritated when I mentioned it. "God, Mom, it's just yogurt," he'd say, not looking up from his computer. "Buy more." When I asked him to contribute to household expenses, he'd say he was between projects, or that his client hadn't paid him yet. But somehow he always had money for the latest video game or for nights out with friends. I'd see the charges on the credit card I'd given him for emergencies: $50 at GameStop, $30 at some bar downtown, $20 for DoorDash when there was perfectly good food in the refrigerator. "Colby, you're 26 years old," I said one morning, standing in his bedroom doorway with an armload of his dirty clothes. "You need to start acting like an adult." He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "I am acting like an adult. I have a job." "You have a hobby that occasionally pays you money," I corrected. "And you're living in your mother's house, eating your mother's food, using your mother's Wi-Fi to run your business." He rolled his eyes. "Jesus, Mom, if you want me to move out so bad, just say so." But that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted him to want to be a contributing member of our household, to treat me with respect, to show some appreciation for everything I'd done and continued to do for him. I wanted the sweet little boy who used to bring me dandelions and tell me I was the prettiest mommy in the world. Instead, I had a grown man who treated me like hired help. The breaking point came on a Thursday in November. I remember it was Thursday because I'd spent the entire day at school dealing with parent-teacher conferences, listening to other parents worry about their teenagers' grades and attitudes and futures. Mrs. Henderson had cried about her daughter's college prospects. Mr. Patterson had asked what he could do to help his son with his reading comprehension. These parents were so invested in their children's success, so worried about their well-being. I came home exhausted, looking forward to a quiet evening, maybe a cup of tea and an episode of the British baking show I'd been following. Instead, I walked into a disaster zone. Colby had apparently had friends over while I was at work. There were pizza boxes on the coffee table, empty beer bottles on the kitchen counter, and someone had spilled something sticky on the hardwood floor in the hallway. The sink was full of dishes, and the trash was overflowing onto the floor. Colby was in his room with his door closed, probably editing some project or playing online games with his headphones on, completely oblivious to the mess. I stood in my own kitchen, looking at the chaos, and I felt something inside me just break. Not dramatically, not all at once, but like a rope that's been bearing too much weight for too long and finally snaps. I knocked on his door. "Colby, can you come out here, please?" "Kinda busy, Mom. Can it wait?" "No, it can't wait." He emerged from his room with an annoyed sigh, still wearing the same clothes he'd had on for 3 days. "What?" I gestured at the living room. "What is this?" He looked around like he was seeing the mess for the first time. "Oh yeah, Jeremy and some guys came over. We were working on this collaboration project, and you thought it was appropriate to leave this for me to clean up?" He shrugged. I was going to get to it. When? When were you going to get to it, Colby? Another shrug. "I don't know. Later." And that's when I lost it. 20 years of bottled-up frustration came pouring out. Later? Later when? After I've already cleaned it up? After I've already done your laundry and paid your phone bill and made your dinner? When exactly in your busy schedule of playing video games and hanging out with your friends were you planning to contribute to this household? He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Mom, why are you being so dramatic? It's just some pizza. Boxes." "It's not about the pizza boxes," I shouted, and I almost never shout. "It's about the fact that you're 27 years old, and you treat me like I'm your personal servant. It's about the fact that you take and take and take and never give anything back. It's about the fact that I've spent the last 20 years of my life sacrificing everything for you, and you can't even be bothered to clean up after yourself." His face went red. "I never asked you to sacrifice anything. I never asked you to do all this stuff for me." And that was the moment I realized he was right. He'd never asked me to enable him, to do everything for him, to treat him like he was incapable of taking care of himself. I'd made those choices. I'd created this monster, and now I was angry at him for being exactly what I'd raised him to be. But realizing you've made a mistake and being able to fix it are two different things. "You're right," I said quietly. "You never asked me to do any of those things. But I did them anyway, because I love you. And I thought that maybe, just maybe, you might love me enough to show me some basic respect in return." He softened a little then. "Mom, of course I love you. You're my mom. Then act like it, Colby. Act like you love me. Act like you appreciate what I do for you. Act like you care about my feelings." He promised he'd do better. He apologized and gave me a hug and helped me clean up the mess. For about a week, things were different. He loaded the dishwasher a few times, took out the trash without being asked, even brought me flowers from the grocery store. But old habits die hard, and within a month, we were back to the same pattern. The only difference was that now I could see it clearly. I could see how he'd learned to manage me with just enough affection and just enough help to keep me from exploding again. I could see how manipulative it was, even if he wasn't doing it consciously. I started to understand that I'd taught him that my love was unconditional, which meant he never had to earn it. I'd taught him that I would always be there to clean up his messes, literally and figuratively. I'd taught him that his needs were more important than mine, that his comfort mattered more than my well-being. And I'd taught him that mothers exist to serve their children, not to be respected by them. That winter, I started seeing a counselor. Dr. Patricia Vance had an office in downtown Eureka Springs, and she specialized in family dynamics and grief counseling. I told her I was having trouble with my adult son, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud at first, that I'd raised an entitled, disrespectful man who treated me like household help. "Tell me about your relationship with Colby," she said during our first session. So I did. I told her about Marcus's death, about trying to be everything to Colby, about the years of enabling and excuse-making. I told her about the mess that had been my breaking point, about how nothing had really changed since then. "It sounds like you've been parenting from a place of guilt," Dr. Vance said. Guilt about Marcus's death, guilt about Colby not having a father, guilt about not being enough. On your own, she was right, of course. I'd spent 20 years trying to make up for Marcus's absence by being perfect, by never saying no, by putting Colby's wants above my own needs. "But here's what I want you to understand, Marlene," she continued. "You can't love someone into being a good person. Love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling. And enabling someone isn't helping them. It's keeping them from growing into the person they're capable of becoming." We talked about boundaries, about natural consequences, about the difference between helping and enabling. She gave me homework assignments, small ways to start stepping back and letting Colby handle his own problems. But every time I tried to implement what we'd discussed, I'd lose my nerve. When Colby's car broke down and he expected me to pay for the repairs, I managed to tell him he needed to figure it out himself. But then I watched him stress about it for 3 days, calling his friends to ask for rides, complaining about how unfair life was, and I caved. I paid for the repairs. He seemed so upset. I told Dr. Vance the next week. "And how did you feel when you paid for his car?" she asked. "Tired," I admitted. "And angry at myself." "And how did Colby react when you gave him the money?" I thought about it. He said thanks, but he didn't seem surprised. He seemed like he'd expected me to pay for it all along. Dr. Vance nodded. "Because you've taught him to expect it. Every time you rescue him from the natural consequences of his choices, you're reinforcing the lesson that someone else will always be there to fix his problems." The hardest part was realizing that I'd been getting something out of the dynamic, too. As long as Colby needed me, I felt important. I felt like I had a purpose. Without him to take care of, who was I? What was my identity beyond being his mother, his caretaker, his problem solver? Dr. Vance helped me see that I'd been afraid of Colby becoming independent because I was afraid he wouldn't love me anymore if he didn't need me. I'd confused being needed with being loved, and in doing so, I'd prevented both of us from having a healthy relationship. "What would it look like if Colby loved you without needing you?" she asked one day. I'd never really considered that possibility. I'd been so focused on being indispensable that I'd never imagined being simply cherished. Spring came early that year, and I started making changes. Small ones at first. I stopped doing Colby's laundry, stopped buying groceries for him specifically, stopped cleaning his room. He was annoyed but adaptable. He started doing his own laundry, badly, started buying his own food, mostly cereal and frozen dinners, started living in his own mess. But the bigger issues remained. He still expected me to bail him out financially when he overspent. He still treated me like a roommate he barely tolerated rather than like his mother. He still showed no real appreciation for everything I'd done for him over the years. And then I found out about the house. I'd been meaning to update my will, to make sure everything was in order in case something happened to me. When I met with my lawyer, George Hartwell, he reminded me that the house was in my name only. Marcus had inherited it from his parents, and when he died, it became mine. Colby had no legal claim to it. "Just something to keep in mind as you're planning," George said. "A lot of people assume their children will inherit their homes automatically, but that's not how it works." I'd never really thought about it before. In my mind, the house was Colby's inheritance, his security. But legally, it was mine to do with as I pleased. That night, lying in bed, I started thinking about what I actually wanted for the rest of my life. I was 58 years old. If I was lucky, I had 20 or 30 good years left. Did I want to spend them being treated like hired help by my own son? Did I want to enable his immaturity until one of us died? I thought about my friend Linda, who lived in Lansboro, Minnesota. She'd been widowed around the same time I had, but she'd made different choices. She'd moved closer to her daughter but maintained her independence. She'd started volunteering at the local library, had joined a book club, had even started dating again. When I talked to her on the phone, she sounded happy, content, like she was living her own life instead of just facilitating someone else's. You should come visit, she'd said during our last conversation. Lansboro is beautiful in the summer. There's this amazing bike trail, and the whole town comes alive with tourists and artists. I'd made polite noises about maybe visiting sometime, but I'd never seriously considered it. How could I leave? Colby needed me, except, did he really? Or had I just convinced myself he did because I needed to feel needed? That's when I started planning. I didn't do it to hurt Colby, though I knew it would. I did it because I finally understood that the greatest gift I could give him was the chance to grow up, to face consequences, to learn that actions have results, and that other people's feelings matter. And I did it because I deserved better than to spend the rest of my life being taken for granted. I started quietly. I researched the real estate market, talked to a few agents about what the house might be worth. I looked into small towns in Minnesota, places where a retired teacher might be able to afford a modest home on her pension and Social Security. I called Linda and asked if she'd be serious about having a long-term house guest while I figured out my next steps. Of course, she'd said immediately. Marlene, I've been worried about you for years. You sound so tired all the time, so resigned. You deserve to be happy. It took me 3 months to work up the courage to list the house. I chose a realtor in the next town over, someone who didn't know our family, and I scheduled all the showings for when Colby was supposed to be out. I told myself I was just exploring my options, that I probably wouldn't go through with it. But the house sold faster than anyone expected. A young couple with a baby fell in love with the place, and they made an offer that was too good to refuse. The closing was scheduled for the end of July. I still hadn't told Colby. I knew I should have. I knew he deserved to know what was happening. But every time I started to bring it up, I'd lose my nerve. What would I say? Son, I'm selling the house you think you're going to inherit because you've treated me badly for the past 10 years. It sounded petty when I put it like that, even though I knew it was about much more than hurt feelings. 2 weeks before the closing, Colby announced that he was going to spend a month in Colorado with his friend Jeremy, who'd moved to Denver, and needed help with some big animation project. It was perfect timing, though I didn't tell him that. That sounds like a great opportunity, I said, and I meant it. When do you leave? Next Tuesday. Jeremy's paying for the flight and everything. It's going to be awesome. I helped him pack, the way I'd been helping him pack for trips since he was a child. I made sure he had enough clean clothes, that he'd remembered his phone charger, that he had his ID and his boarding pass printed out. For a moment, watching him fold his t-shirts, badly, into his suitcase, he looked so young and excited that I almost changed my mind about everything. But then he said, "Oh, Mom, can you make sure to pay my car insurance while I'm gone? It's due next week." And I remembered why I was doing this. The day after Colby left for Colorado, I started packing. I'd lived in that house for 30 years, and I had a lifetime of memories to sort through. I found Marcus's old teaching supplies in the basement, lesson plans written in his careful handwriting about the Civil War and the Great Depression. I found photo albums from Colby's childhood, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and family vacations to Branson and Hot Springs. There were so many pictures of the three of us together, back when we were a complete family. Marcus lifting toddler Colby onto his shoulders at the zoo. Me reading bedtime stories with Colby curled up beside me. The three of us building a snowman in the backyard during the blizzard of '98. I cried over those photos. I cried for Marcus, who'd missed so much of Colby's life. I cried for the little boy Colby had been, so sweet and affectionate and full of wonder. And I cried for myself, for the mother I'd been back then, tired but happy, overwhelmed but content, secure in the knowledge that we were building something good together. I packed the photos carefully in a box marked Colby, along with his baby books and report cards, and the macaroni necklace he'd made me for Mother's Day when he was 6. Whatever happened between us, he deserved to have those memories. I took only what I needed: clothes, books, my jewelry, the china set that had been my grandmother's. Everything else I left for him: the furniture, the kitchen appliances, Marcus's tools in the garage, even the piano that Colby had taken lessons on for 2 years before deciding he didn't like it. I wrote him a letter. I must have written 20 drafts, trying to find the right words, trying to explain without sounding like I was attacking him. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't about punishment. It was about love. It was about loving him enough to let him fail, to let him figure out who he was when no one was there to cushion every fall. The final version was 3 pages long. I told him about his father, about the promises we'd made when he was born, about how losing Marcus had scared me into trying to be everything to him. I told him about the guilt I'd carried, about how I'd confused love with service, about how I'd enabled his dependence instead of encouraging his growth. I told him I was proud of his talent, of his creativity, of the man he could become if he chose to. I told him I would always love him, but that I couldn't continue to enable the person he'd become. I told him I hoped someday he'd understand, and I told him about the house fund. Even as I was planning to leave, I couldn't quite bring myself to leave him with nothing. I'd set aside $20,000 from the house sale, enough for him to get an apartment and get established, but not enough for him to coast indefinitely. I'd put it in a savings account with his name on it, but he could only access it after meeting with a financial counselor and creating a budget. "This isn't about punishing you," I wrote. "This is about giving you the chance to become the person I know you can be, the person your father would be proud of." I left the letter on his desk, along with the keys to the house and the contact information for the account manager at the bank. Linda picked me up on a Thursday morning. I took one last walk through the empty house, remembering all the life that had happened within those walls. I thought about Marcus making pancakes on Sunday mornings, about Colby taking his first steps in the living room, about Christmas mornings and birthday parties and quiet evenings watching TV together. "Are you ready?" Linda asked gently. I wasn't. I don't think I ever could have been ready to leave the life I'd built, even though it had become a life that was slowly killing my spirit. But sometimes you have to do things you're not ready for, because the alternative is staying stuck forever. "I'm ready," I said. The drive to Minnesota took 8 hours. Linda and I talked about everything and nothing. Old friends from college, books we'd read, places we wanted to travel. She didn't ask me if I was having second thoughts, didn't try to talk me out of what I'd done. She just let me process, let me grieve, let me be quietly terrified about what came next. Lansboro was everything Linda had promised. A small town nestled in the bluffs along the Root River, with historic buildings and art galleries, and a bike trail that stretched for miles through some of the most beautiful countryside I'd ever seen. Her house was a modest 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden full of hostas and black-eyed Susans. "The guest room is yours for as long as you need it," she said as she showed me around. "There's no rush, no pressure. Just take your time figuring out what you want to do next." I unpacked my few boxes and tried to settle into a routine. I helped Linda with her garden, went on long walks along the river, started reading all the books I'd been too tired to enjoy when I was still managing Colby's life. It was strange, having time to think my own thoughts, to make my own decisions about how to spend my days. The guilt was overwhelming at first. Every day, I'd wonder what Colby was doing, whether he was eating properly, whether he was managing his finances, whether he was angry or hurt or scared. I'd drafted a dozen texts, messages asking if he was okay, but I'd never sent them. This was the hardest part of love, stepping back and letting someone you care about struggle. 3 weeks after I left, Linda found me crying in the garden. "Want to talk about it?" she asked, settling down beside me on the stone bench. "I keep thinking about him as a little boy," I said. "When he was 7 and his dad died, he used to have these nightmares. He'd wake up crying and climb into my bed, and I'd hold him until he fell back asleep. He was so small, Linda. So scared and broken and little. He's not little anymore, Marlene." I know that. But in my head, he's still that 7-year-old who needed me to make everything okay. Linda was quiet for a moment, watching the river flow past. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you did the bravest thing you could do. You loved him enough to let him grow up, even though it meant risking your relationship with him. That's not something a bad mother does, Marlene. That's something a good mother does when she's finally ready to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing." 4 weeks after I left Arkansas, I got an email from Colby. The subject line was just, "Mom." And when I saw it in my inbox, my heart started racing. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The email was 2 sentences long. "I came home to an empty house in your letter. I don't understand why you did this to me." That was it. No questions about whether I was safe. No acknowledgement of anything I'd written in the letter. No indication that he'd reflected on our relationship at all. Just hurt and accusation, and the assumption that I'd done something to him, rather than for him. I cried for an hour after reading it. Then I wrote back, "I love you, Colby. I hope someday you'll understand that this is because I love you, not in